Blessed Good Friday to the gentle
Yes, good
listeners
morning.
and watchers. Yeah. So, Jim, can you show that book again? You were
Sure.
just contemplating.
That's right. You just happened to catch me in my.
Yeah, and it's just stoic, epic professor mode, right? I just turned on the
Exactly,
camera, and
yeah.
Jim's right there reading
Here's Jim.
Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
Now, Schopenhauer wasn't a particularly pious figure, now was he?
I mean, not in a conventional sense, but I think he was a pious man.
Yeah, his general reverence at the abyss, I guess. I don't know how to describe Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think a Hindu would recognize him as quite pious, right? And I think he was probably pious in the same sense that Socrates was. Yeah.
Very fascinating. How are you finding your re-exploration of Schopenhauer currently?
It's been fabulous. I'm reading it. I'm kind of one second here. I'm kind of backing my way from Nietzsche into Schopenhauer. So I had kind of read on both sides. I went on a big Kant kick for a while, then went on a big Nietzsche kick for a while, and now I'm kind of reading back to Schopenhauer. And
Cool.
Reading Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation after reading Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy has been really fruitful. So
good one-two combo there.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, it's helping me understand them both pretty
cool.
profoundly. Yeah.
Yeah, you've inspired me to want to go back and read some of those guys. I probably haven't picked up anything from Schopenhauer since late high school or early college, which means I probably grossly misunderstood him when I last read him.
Yeah, gosh, yeah. I mean, there's lots of stuff that I read now, like when I was your age. I'm like, oh my gosh, I wasn't ready. Right. I wasn't ready to understand it. Yeah. And I would recommend, if you want to do a Nietzsche read, I got a freebie from a publisher because I adopted it for class. There's an edition, I forget the publisher both, but of The Birth of Tragedy and the Genealogy of Morals of Nietzsche, translated by Francis Goffling. It was actually one of the first undergraduate books in philosophy I got, right? So I hadn't read this translation in 25, 27 years, whatever it was.
Nice.
And I tell you, that translation is great. And the juxtaposition of those two texts together is great. And you have a preface to The Birth of Tragedy that Nietzsche wrote about the time he was writing the Genealogy of Morals.
Yeah, no, that's sweet because genealogy I've revisited numerous times. And I wrote a paper in my master's program linking a lot of Nietzsche's thought there to political correctness. I'm sure the parallels are pretty obvious for anyone who studied Nietzsche, right? We'll put that aside for now because we're going to focus. We're going to do a gentle listeners, gentle watchers. If you're tuning in live, please like and subscribe and all that good stuff. We'll try to get to some live questions as well, but I promised people that we would get to questions that were sent in from various places. Some are comments that we'll just reflect on Instagram, the blog, email, etc. Philosophy and theology themed.
Excellent.
It is Good Friday. Very important day for us, isn't it, Jim?
Right. It is. It is indeed. Yes.
So yeah, cool, man. Should we just dive right in then?
Let's dive in. All
right, let me pull up the old document here. All right, I'm gonna leave names out of it because let me say this: if you send in a question to me and it's not on YouTube, it doesn't have your name on it, I'm generally just going to leave your name out unless you ask me to put it in. I feel like that's probably the better policy for this sort of thing.
I agree.
And part of the reason is I try to get back to as much as I can, like individually, but it's just a lot. So oftentimes it just helps for me to just bring stuff on the podcast and talk about it, because chances are if somebody has a question, at least one other person has something similar of a question. So, and it gives
my students this every day.
Right. So here we are. All right, here's the first one. It's a little bit longer. I'm just going to read it, and it's related to themes that are quite important for today. This gentle listener says, "I've been a long-time listener. Thank you for the excellent podcast. I'd like to ask you to pray for me. I am preparing for my baptism on Saturday, and I'm struggling with doubts, skepticism, and fear. My main area of struggle is simply the question of whether this really is Christ's church, which he will protect. When I see the issues in the church, the scandals, the unfaithful bishops, the decline in memberships, etc., I get overwhelmed and ask myself, why bother? Then, of course, there is history, the Eucharist, the teachings, and I stay around a little longer. So I'm asking for prayer and potentially advice. I want so badly to trust Christ, to trust the church, but it seems hard." Okay, so Jim, if I am positive that you've encountered some stuff like this before. So what do we want to say about this? This is a very good, and by the way, this is not uncommon. I get this in my inbox.
Oh yeah,
quite a bit.
The first thing I would say, and man, maybe this, we'll see. You don't have to do this Saturday. I mean, the church will be here next Easter, right? The church will be here so if you're not ready to do this, don't do it. Right. The church was here last year, it'll be here next year. Right. So one, if you're not ready to do this, you're not ready to commit to this, then I would hold off. Okay. Or I shouldn't even say, I should say it's okay to hold off if you're not ready, because there's probably pressure, to get it over with, all that. Okay. So one, just trust that nothing has to happen this weekend. Okay. But I'll also say this, any of the really, really huge decisions you make in life, you will not have 100% certainty about that going in. Okay. I use the example of marriage quite a bit. I mean, one of the problems with marriage is you are in no position to make a decision about marriage until you're about 10 years into a marriage. Okay. Right. I mean, marriage is a crapshoot in so many ways. And by the hand of Providence, I've done damn well. Okay. But I don't think you don't even know what counts as a good marriage. I really don't think you do until you've been married. I don't think you really know a woman until you've had a child with her.
This is something I've come to appreciate for sure.
Yeah. And so, and I don't care if it's taking a job. I don't care if it's marriage. I don't care if it's a religious conversion, choosing a profession. Oh my gosh, you cannot, you don't know anything about your profession until you get into it. All these things. And so you're not going to have 100% certainty going in. So at some point, if you're going to say, you're going to join the Catholic Church or anything, you're going to have to, at some point, squeeze the trigger without 100% certainty. Okay. Right. And I'll say this, when it comes to a religion, you will never have 100% certainty of that thing. Right. I think if you're honest with yourself.
Right.
Okay. Especially Christianity, which claims, one of its dogmas of the faith of all forms of Christianity is, in fact, it's a faith. Okay. That there is something deeply epistemically underdetermined about this thing. And if you're looking for complete certainty, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So my two upfront things I would say is, one, you don't have to do it. Okay. The church will be here in a year. Right. Mm-hmm. You can wait till you feel more ready. But two, if what you're waiting for is absolute certainty, that ain't going to happen. Nor will that happen with anything in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts on this, right? Because I'm somebody who came into the church as well.
Yeah.
So it also ties into another question. Somebody else asked, with so many different options out there, how does one evaluate different religions? Is it ever possible to know for sure that any one is true? And I'm putting it out there because I think maybe we can put these two together. The first thing I'll say with this, when it comes to evaluating the Catholic Church, this is going to sound cheeky, but like, say you have this hypothesis, right, that Catholicism is true. Okay. Well, what does that predict and what does it not predict? Because a lot of people think that certain data points count as evidence against the Catholic hypothesis, but they're not data points that the Catholic hypothesis predicts not X. See what I'm saying? Right. There's nothing about the church and her essential teachings that says there will be no scandal, for example, right? There will be no in fact, it's the opposite, right? The church is just, yes, it is under God's providence, but God works through fallible and often deeply depraved people, right? So that's not to say that we shouldn't be bothered or disturbed or even outraged when scandal or anything like that happens or unfaithfulness happens. We should be, but we should understand that a data point can a data point X can only count against a hypothesis if the hypothesis predicts not X. See what I'm saying? Right. The Catholic Church doesn't predict not X on this front, right? So as disturbing as this is, and I want to acknowledge it is disturbing, it is troubling. We should be upset by this and pray that we ourselves never fall into it. It doesn't actually count against the Catholic hypothesis, right? What would count against the Catholic hypothesis would be, I've used this example before, there's a Vatican III, and the church changes her essential teachings on the Trinity or something like that. Because the Catholic teaches indefectibility on matters of essential teachings with regard to faith and morals. So if there was something that was changed about a dogma like the Trinity, I would say, that's when I personally would be like, I was wrong, right? I was wrong. And Jim, we've talked about this before. Like, it is, even if you can't have certainty on certain situations, which I fully agree with, it is important to try and establish for yourself some criteria of falsifiability. When would you know that you just, this isn't working with you? So just to build on everything that you said, Jim, that's the way I think about it. And I'm not saying that this listener is saying that these things count against the truth of Catholicism. I think he understands that they don't. I think it's more of just an internal personal struggle. And to me, that's like the problem of evil. Like the problem of evil, the more deeply I think about it, we talked about this last time, the more I really am convinced that evil is actually evidence for God, not against God. But that doesn't mean that I'm not deeply disturbed by it, troubled by it on a regular basis, because I certainly am, right? And there's just like this tension that always goes on between like what your reason is telling you and just like your emotions and feelings. So I dance that dance all the time, and I appreciate that.
You know, I mean, the church does, make a claim for itself, and the bishops make a claim for themselves that, they are the succession from St. Peter, right? And I think they could behave badly enough for you to think, these guys are not in fact in contact with St. Peter anymore, right? I'm not saying they've reached that point or anything, but
you're saying there's a threshold for Jim Madden.
That,
if every priest, every bishop were found to be in some like demonic child abuse ring, that would probably push you over the edge, right? Yeah.
And I mean, I think the closest I've ever come to like walking out on a homily was when it was right after the last round of the scandals, and the homilist had said, well, if you left the church over this, you just never understood what the church claimed for herself, right? And I get that, but I'm like, and if they touched my kid, I would probably never come back here again, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, I mean, and so I can't blame someone who, like, if they found the line, I cannot blame you, right? And you can say, I know what the church has claimed for herself, but she hasn't behaved as such in this really bad way, systematic or something like that. Okay, so you know what I mean? And I'm not saying it's hit that threshold, but I think to say that someone could never walk out because of the way the bishops have behaved, I think is not. It's once again to make the hypothesis too plastic, right? Where almost anything could count.
I see what you're saying, right? And this ties back to the conversation we had with Mike Matthews before. Is there's, in our sober moments, like what should I do? But then there's like, what would I do?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I don't know. Like I don't know what I would do if I were caught in a terrible situation like that. We can sit back with our coffee here on this podcast and say, well, here's how we should rationally evaluate this. But humans are more complicated than that. So I certainly, no, I don't blame anybody who's left because of this. I think that you shouldn't have left. I'll stand by that. Yeah. But I understand why you did, right?
And there's leaving and there's leaving, right? There's like, I no longer identify myself as with my family, or I just can't stand to be in the room with this guy. right. And I think it's one thing to say, look, I couldn't be in the room with these people, because of what's happened. But yet, and if you are a Catholic and you understand what it is to be a Catholic, you don't really have a choice in the matter whether or not you leave or not at that point, right? You're baptized. You're in a sense, you're kind of stuck, right?
Right.
Which I think is a good thing. But so I think all sorts of things could happen where I would say I can't be in the room with those guys. Okay, but that doesn't mean you've left necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good point. To the other question about evaluation, I think this is a really, really important one. In fact, I was having a conversation with a Muslim just the other day, really fine fellow. And this came up, right? Because when I was kind of looking at the world religions, if you will, and it would be impossible for anybody to evaluate every single one, right?
Yeah, right.
There's just too much out there. So it can't just be a process of elimination if you're going to decide on a religion, right? So the way I think about it is this: like, you kind of have like your background considerations. For me, those were heavily philosophical. So I was like, I'm quite convinced that monotheism is correct, and divine simplicity is going to have to come with that, right? So like that does eliminate a huge number of options, right? Just the philosophical considerations. Quite convinced of a certain conception of the human soul and human person. All right, that eliminates. So like you can take off like large numbers of options, I think, with good philosophy and metaphysics, but there's still a ton of options left, right? Then it does come to me of like inference to the best explanation, and what best explains the data. what is the best story that can be told and what is the most beautiful. And I don't know what is more powerful than the Catholic faith than that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the types of things that I would expect if Catholicism were true are the types of things that I think we see, right?
Right.
And not just the origin of Christianity, but just the fact that the church is still here 2,000 years later. The sort of the winks we get along the way, the Fatimas, Eucharistic miracles, the saints, right? So the perdurance, the what I think is the empirical testimony of the indefectibility of the church on her essential teachings, right? So like this model is so powerful, right, in the story that it tells and the things that it explains. It's like relativity. Like you don't have to examine every possible alternative to it. Like it's just so powerful. Like you just kind of go with this, right?
Yeah.
And like especially if you're looking between Judaism, Christianity and Islam, it's like Judaism seems to predict Christianity in a way that's positive Christianity. Christianity seems to predict Islam in a way that's negative for Islam, i.e. prediction of false prophets, right? So like it's not that hard for Christianity to explain Islam. It's very hard for Islam to explain Christianity historically. And most of Christianity would just accept what Judaism says anyways, right, in terms of miraculous claims for that. So like that's another way to kind of think through it. I don't know. I'm just throwing a bunch of stuff on the table, how I've thought through this stuff. Jim, I'd be curious your thoughts on the adjudicating the religious.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, so two things. So one, here we sit, Padraig and Seamus with Irish surnames. Okay. To think that, I think that, like to, what, I mean, this has a lot to do with how I think about belief and even consciousness, right? To think that somehow though that Christianity in some form or the other, or in particular Catholicism, as we do both sit here with Irish surnames, like there's a reason our people ended up on this side of the Atlantic, and it's because they were Catholic, even if you fell away and that sort of thing, right?
Right.
You bear it in your name. To act as if that cultural history didn't kind of rig the game to some degree of where you would end up once you started thinking religiously, I think, and I'm not accusing this of is naive, right? Just in terms of how we know how humans work and how language works and how dependent we are on it, right? So, what I guess what I'm saying is for me to say that I could actually have like 100% sterile analysis of all the different religions, right? I don't think that's the case, right? I think there is cultural weight that sort of loads the dice that way, right? And especially for me, someone who's like baptized, raised Catholic fairly actively, had, like I think I said before, I sort of fell away in my 20s, but that's just to say I'm Irish, okay, and then came back. But okay, so I think to deny that the cultural weight plays a role, I think is to ignore kind of some of these facts. Okay, but it doesn't mean that you're not epistemically justified in doing it either, right? Okay. So another thing I would add to it is Wilfrid Sellars, very important 20th century philosopher, very important mind development, has a throwaway line. He says that all of our judgments face the bar of experience. They face the bar of sort of empirical verification one way or another, but never individually and only as a corporate body. Okay. So the idea that you are going to look for justifications of the individual judgments of some theory against the empirical world in isolation is to miss how a lot of this works. Okay. And so, or like to think where Quine says, our beliefs are verified, but only at the periphery of the theory, not in the center of it. Okay. So, I don't, seriously, I'm going with this. I don't like have a really high view of miracles, especially like post-biblical miracles. Okay. They play no role in like what holds me to it or like what brought me back to it or something like that. Okay. For me, that sort of stuff that's conclusion, not premise. Okay.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So for me, how do I think about something like that? I guess I would say a much more modest thing. Like Fatima didn't make me Catholic. But the fact Fatima occurred and has been highly resilient to succumbing to any plausible naturalistic hypothesis, like that makes sense on the Catholic hypothesis better than any alternative. That's about all I would want to say about that, right?
Yeah. And so I think like, to kind of go to some of the questions that the gentle listeners have is,
yeah,
for me, and I think this is kind of the same place where you are, is okay. The way I've explained this to people is you've got the branches of the tree out to the twigs, and then you've got the trunk of the tree. Okay.
right.
And you don't climb the tree from branches out, you climb it from trunk out. Okay. And I see a lot of like the way out there twiggy branchy dogma is things I'm stuck with because I'm really into the trunk.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't claim to have much verification for some of the twiggy further out on the branch stuff. And it's a question of the trunk. Okay. So, well, what's the trunk? Okay. For me, one, I mean, I didn't necessarily pick it. I got thrown into this thing, right? I was born baptized. Okay. Into the faith of my father's father and all that. Okay.
Yeah.
But moreover, for me, when I start to ask like why persist, why stay with this, there's just this experience of a kind of lifestyle that I've lived now, right? That the Christian claim and the Catholic claim makes some good sense of, but I'm not aware of an alternative that makes better sense or something that compels me to look for something different, right? So for me too, it's sort of this abductive thing. I have this experience of a certain kind of love, a certain kind of family life, right? A certain kind of commitment, and the church makes sense of that in a way that the alternatives don't, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's
not how I got to it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and what you're bringing up is you're actually giving a nod, and I think more of an acknowledgement to an objection that skeptics often raise to religion than many religious people are willing to concede.
Yeah.
And you're conceding a fair amount of it, and I think you're right to do so. And it's the idea, well, Jim, the only reason you're Catholic is because look at your Irish heritage and where you were born, right? If you were born in Pakistan, you would have been Muslim. And like
that's the only reason I speak English too. Maybe it doesn't mean English doesn't get something right about the world, right?
Yeah, but it does. Yeah, so like that's the general response, right? Is that it's just a genetic fallacy, right? To explain the origins of belief isn't to demonstrate that belief is wrong. It might give you reason to want to be critically reflective, of course.
Exactly.
But what I appreciate about you is like we do like there is something to that, right? Like, okay, I am born into a certain contingent historical social circumstance. That is true. This has played a huge role in how I think about the world, the things I believe, the language I speak. I believe
the people that I love who love this too, right?
Yeah, I believe the earth goes around the sun, mostly because of when and where I was born and the authority I take it on. I haven't done any of those calculations myself personally, right? And I have
not made a lap.
I haven't made a lap, but I guess that's right? So like it's going to cut both ways, right? So like to the skeptic, it's like, okay, well, you were born in Portland, Oregon, right, in 1990, so you're kind of a contingent, the result of contingent circumstances yourself, buddy. So the point I want to say is, yes, it definitely is by no means a good argument against the belief itself, but it does invite, as any person who's philosophically minded should recognize, the invitation for critical reflection on what you believe.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And I think it may also make you come to realize that you're going to have to live with a sort of unresolved critical reflection. Okay. Because I will admit, I understand, like there's in some way, not 100%, but the game's a little rigged towards, Anglo-Saxon stuff, right? Okay, right. It's a little rigged towards, Western Christianity for me, just given the cultural weight they occupy. And there is no thing that is Jim Madden if you strip him out of all that cultural weight, right? Like my personality is formed, right, in part by that participation. But that doesn't mean I can't say, be better or worse in terms of the critical reflection, but to think that I'm going to get full stop, I have stepped out of that and I've looked at all of them objectively 100%. I don't think that's possible in the sciences, and I don't think it's possible in religions either, right?
Yeah, you got to do the best you can.
Yeah.
And we were talking yesterday, and this is something that I get asked often enough. It's like, Pat, if you weren't Catholic, what would you be? And I think I'd be like a broad, like Neoplatonist with a certain attractiveness to like Hinduism. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. I'd be like something like that. But and that's what I was exploring even before Catholicism, the more like sophisticated views of religious pluralism.
Yeah.
But then I just started looking into the historical basis, the claims of the church, and I just realized, I think that this is better, right? That and it comes with greater commitments. That's a scary part. At least what I was playing around with before. Because I used to read a lot of, I'm sure you've read them, like Huxley and perennial philosophy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that was kind of what I was playing around with before. So, I'm not ignorant of these other belief systems. I think there's a lot of truth and beauty to them.
Right.
I just think at the end of the day, there's no better story that could be told than the Catholic one.
Right.
And will you ever get 100% certainty? No. But can you get enough?
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, and this might be the cradle Catholic thing, right? I don't know if there's no better story that could be told, but it's the one I have, right? And it is a story that reveals a great deal to me, right? And I don't hear a better one. Right?
Yeah. I love the experiential aspects because I always have to tell my audience, I hope that these conversations don't come off as like two Spocks, right?
Yeah,
like that's not it. Like there are deep, I mean, for my wife especially, but definitely strongly for me, like before we were religious and we had our first child, she really struggled. Like I have this transcendent love for this child. My husband drugged me into an atheistic worldview, and I don't know how to explain what this is.
Yeah.
You see, right? So like to you, like the love component is a huge one. The Catholic story gives a story about love that deeply fits with what I feel that I'm experiencing with the love with my wife, my friends, my children, etc. Right?
Yep.
All right, let's move on to another one. We'll take one from the live stream here, guys. So we'll take a few here as we move along. So send in whatever questions you have. JW says, what movement of philosophy poses the greatest challenge to classical theism or Christian belief today? Is it rationalism, existentialism, postmodern relativistic thought, or something else? Good question. Whatever you think, Jim. First off, I am something of an existentialist, but not in the way that this listener is thinking of it.
I mean, like in a very technical sense, I think I am actually. But I mean, I'll say to that is like, Christianity has lived through worse than all of that, right? Okay, I think one of the biggest problems, like with Christianity and contemporary philosophy, is we are exposing a much broader swath of the population to philosophy than we ever have in the history of the West, right? And it's done, in one or two general education classes that people cheat their way through in college, right? Okay, and which gives them the impression that they know something about this, and they can then evaluate worldviews based on it. Did you see my point?
I do.
And so I think the greatest threat to, say, Christianity or classical theism from philosophy today is not any one of these particular positions. There are versions of these that have been around. I mean, like postmodern relativism, go read Gorgias, man. That's pre-modern, postmodern relativism in the ancient Greek world. None of this stuff is new.
Yeah, nothing is new.
Yeah. So what the threat from philosophy is right now, I think, to everything, okay, is it's just so badly done in the universities. It's sloppy. Like it's pedagogically sloppy, right? And so I'm not worried about any of those isms. I'm worried about the making of philosophy superficial and popular in a way that I think is irresponsible. And it's being done mostly in the general education programs in universities.
Yeah. Say another word about that, if you don't mind, Jim, because I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I mean, so like take your typical intro to philosophy class in a college, right? A lot of times there haven't been really deep curricular decisions made about this. It's sort of just whatever the hell that person wants to do. Okay. It may or may be taught by somebody who's actually competent, I mean, like in terms of degrees, but I wouldn't say it's more than degrees. Like, I don't know how much right you have to teach philosophy till you've been doing it a very long time, but we throw people into it in like their early 20s now, right? So I think like the selection of the material can just have a lot to do with just whatever the hell is on that person's mind, not what is substantively best for, right, bringing people to be able to like actually philosophize. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. And two, a lot of times when you get an introduction to philosophy class is you're going to say, hey, this is the problem with any introductory class to any discipline. We're going to do a couple of weeks of epistemology and we're going to read Descartes, and you're going to come away with the impression that Descartes was some kind of moron who missed all of these big gaps in his arguments. Next, we're going to do metaphysics, and we're going to read Aristotle, and we're going to come away with the sense that Aristotle was some kind of moron because he missed all these big gaps in his.
So true.
True. Or then we're going to do ethics, and we're going to read G.E. Moore or something, right, or Kant. We think Kant's just a complete moron. So it's just this like just quick survey, set them up, shoot them down thing. we don't appreciate the genius of any of these people.
Yes.
And I think it just it engenders skepticism. It engenders people to think philosophy is just complete bullshit, a bunch of wrong answers that you're and you're just going to buffet pick which one fits your commitment,
personal fancy, right?
Yeah, personal fancy, yeah. And that class could be taught by use the listeners, examples, some rationalists, some existentialists, some postmodern relativists, some analytic. It can be taught by a Thomist too, right? I mean, I think this is not done well, right, in general, right?
Okay. Certainly, right. So I was telling you, one of my first philosophy professors, she was a strong form moral relativist. She was so like I do think like, what is the most culturally significant challenge right now? I mean, but there's links between existentialism and relativism too, right? But relativism is difficult, right? Because it certainly wants to say whatever else religion is, it is it's not something that could be rationally adjudicated, and I think we're gonna push back against that, right? Personal identity issues, all the kind of the cultural moment we're having right now is very relativistic. It's definitely something that emerges from this postmodern type of thought.
With these kinds of questions, though, this is not necessarily JW's question, but when you get these questions, what's the big challenge today, or what's wrong with the culture today? I think a lot of times it's asking me to do a kind of armchair sociology that I shouldn't be doing. Okay, so when I get a paper from a student that says, in today's culture, right, I take a red pen, I put a big line next to that and a frown face and say, you just made a claim that you have no basis for making whatsoever. Like, how do you know what today's culture is? And I think a lot of times we get our impression of the culture or society from what we're seeing in social media, which of course represents only the lunatic fringes, right?
This is true. Yeah. Okay. Social media has a strong selection bias, my friend. So you have to remember that.
And probably media has always had a strong selection bias. Like it's the people most concerned about issues that are the most likely talking to them in print or what have you.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily represent the culture, right? Or the
that's a good point. Yeah. All right. Sorry, Daniel. I didn't mean to skip over you. He wanted us to go back to this one. So, Jim, this one will be good for you because I'd be curious how your thoughts and how you think about philosophy of mind would pertain to this. So he says, how would the resurrection of the body work? Does God gather up every atom that made up your body long after one is decomposed? Would it still be you or just a perfect copy of you? Thanks. So the first thing I'll say to Daniel before you answer, Jim, is our friend Gavin Kerr had a good conversation on this very question. On I think it was the Classical Theism podcast. So check one of the most recent episodes on there, and you'll hear Gavin Kerr give his sort of metaphysical explanation of this. But I'd be curious your thoughts, Jim.
Yeah,
you are a corruptionist, right?
Oh hell yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's such a cool name. Like,
is there another kind, son?
Maybe give a little background of what that position is. And maybe some of the competing views, and then tie it into how maybe you would answer this question.
Yeah, so my view is you will not exist after your death prior to a resurrection. Okay, so I don't think a disembodied soul is you. Okay, I think what you are, right, is
the soul survives, but not the person.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and and as you know, I'm increasingly very apathetic about soul survival and like what even that means, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So I think if you're going to have Jim Madden, you got to have, just in the current case, this 180 pounds of meat have to show up. Okay. Cause I am this 180 pounds of like thinking meat. Okay. With, that's related to something eternal. Okay. But to have, okay. So, the question, and so there are some people who think, that my position, the corruptionist, is that Jim Madden is a living body. Living bodies are always of this sort, spatially located, what have you. And so upon my demise and the decomposition of my body, I will not exist, and then I will exist, after a resurrection. Okay. But there's other views that say no, like, human being, even among Thomas, human beings are living bodies. They're form, matter, compounds like everything else. But it's possible that the human could be constituted by just one element of that, namely the soul during an interim state, and therefore you still exist in the interim between your death and your resurrection. Okay. And there's lots of vigorous debate about this, right?
Yeah, and I don't have a settled view on this yet. I'm still weighing options.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess if pressed, I would say, yeah, I'm a corruptionist, but as you know, like where I'm kind of gone, and I think the whole debate's kind of morbid because I don't think we really know what we're talking about at this point when you start talking post-death, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, but how would resurrection work? Does God have to collect every single atom, right? Well, he doesn't have to collect every single atom that has ever composed Jim Madden in order to have Jim Madden right now. Okay,
right.
so I'm gonna like gain some atoms, and I just lost some a little while ago. Okay, or there goes some atoms. All right, so whatever I am, I'm not identical to this collection of atoms.
Mm-hmm.
There's not even a consistent 100% collection, like core set of atoms that is me throughout my entire duration, et cetera, et cetera. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so whatever resurrection is, it's not that. Okay, it's
Mm-hmm.
not literal collection. Okay,
Yeah.
how it works beyond that, I'm not sure, and I don't think anyone can say they are sure. All right.
But you're saying the atom thing shouldn't be an issue because if it is, it's an issue now, right?
Yeah, it's an issue now. Yeah. Okay. And like you could get into, like if you want to go like way down, like a very Thomistic thinking about holomorphism, what makes this? So there's a collection of atoms I'm sitting on, and there's a collection of atoms that's this 180 pounds of Jim here.
Thinking meat. Mm-hmm.
Thinking meat. Yeah. Thinking about meat.
It's both and, yeah.
Both and, yeah. And what makes this Jim and the chair something else, even though we're in physical contact, right? Is there's a developmental history, right? That is this 180 pounds is associated with, that this chair is not. Okay, call that the soul, right? Okay, and so whatever individuates matter as the matter of a thing is its relationship to a soul. So you could think whatever 180 pounds of meat is in relationship to Jim's, dispositional developmental history, right? His soul,
right?
That's Jim. Okay. And, I think now when you start bringing in like, omnipotence and all this stuff in a resurrection scenario, it doesn't seem impossible. There's no contradiction in God conjuring up 180 pounds, right, in the right relationship to Jim's history that would do it.
Right. Yeah. Good stuff. I appreciate that explanation. Is the last talk you gave on the soul at that college was excellent. Is that available for replay?
I don't know if they have it up yet. I'll check.
Okay. Do you have one that's similar enough that we could point people to?
I think the one I did at Florida State, which is it's not the same one, but it's similar, I think that is up on SoundCloud for the Thomistic Institute.
Okay. Yeah. And, gentle listeners, if any of you could just Google Jim Madden Thomistic Institute and maybe just throw that in the comments or something, that'd be appreciated, because you go through I love it. It's the classic, just Aristotelian way of thinking about the soul, right? It's not, some of the arguments that I still entertain, that I like, the identity arguments, the Jim Ross arguments. Yours is, but there is advantages to the Aristotelian way of thinking about it because it's grounded in deeper metaphysical considerations. Yeah. Right.
And all of it's consistent, I think, with the route that you'll take. I think Gavin takes, right?
Yeah.
It's a different approach, right?
Yeah. All right. Sweet. All right. I see you guys in the live chat. Keep the questions coming there, but I did promise I'd get some more of the questions over that were sent in advance. So let's switch gears back. You good on time right now, Jim?
Yeah. I'm just checking the battery here.
Yeah.
No, we're good. Good battery.
Yeah, this is fun. Okay, here's an interesting one. I know most Thomists are skeptical, but what are your guys' thoughts on ontological arguments for God? You want me to go first on this one? I do have a paper on this, and I put it up on my blog, and it was here's what I would say about this. There was an interesting conversation recently on Matt Fradd's show before I was on there between a friend of mine, Josh Rasmussen, who's done work on modal ontological arguments, and him and Fradd were just having a good old conversation, and there was a lot of talking past each other. It was a good example of like somebody who's like coming from a Thomistic position and somebody who's coming from like your analytic and like just like terminological issues.
Thomas says they're wrong, so they're wrong.
Yeah. So here's what I think about it.
Plantinga says they're right, so they're right.
I think we have to grant that Plantinga's argument is valid, but we're not sure if it's sound, right? So let's just say this: Plantinga's,
which has been the story about ontological arguments forever,
right? And like the most ardent skeptics will say, yeah, the logical machinery here, like it's solid, right? Like if you can give me the first premise, I'll grant you the conclusion, right? So that's what I would say. And then the question is, and what the first premise is, God is possible. That's really the first premise, right?
Yeah.
Then I think recent developments on this are actually helpful because, well, let me give some more background, right? What you have is this sort of like tug of war between theists and skeptics over that first premise. And the skeptic will say, you can't break the symmetry on that, right? At best, like it's a perpetual stalemate, right? If you could break the symmetry, the argument goes through, the ontological argument is sound. What I want to say is we can break the symmetry, but it might be in ways that aren't useful to the ontological argument. We could break the symmetry with a cosmological argument,
which is what Leibniz does this.
Right. But then you don't need the ontological argument. Well, fair enough, but we showed that it's sound, right?
Leibniz famously does this. He says, if God is possible, then he's necessary. Well, how do you know God is possible? Well, because he's actual, because first cause.
Right. So like that's kind of like a funny way of dealing with it. But
thank you, Gottfried. But
right. Yeah. But I think there's other things. One is the kind of new arguments. This was in my paper, and I'm building off stuff by like Rasmussen and Proust of possible causes. So if you just start with the idea that possibly every natural thing has a cause, possibly every finite bounded thing has a cause, which seems very plausible to me, then possibly there's going to have to be one supernatural thing, and then possibly God exists and the argument goes through, right? So you're using a different possibility argument to break the symmetry. I think there's something there, and that's what I played around with. Brian Leftow has some other things where he just says, well, look, there's just other evidence that maybe isn't decisive, but helps break the possibility premise. He actually, to Jim's chagrin, like will use like near-death experiences and stuff. It's like, it seems like people who are mystical experiences like really experience God in some way. And you're right. So like maybe you can't do it decisively, but Leftow seems to want to just like pile up other independent pieces of evidence that can start to break the symmetry a little bit.
I actually like the near-death thing in that case.
Do you?
Because I do this in Mind, Matter, Nature, where I'm like at my most anti-near-death experience. Right. I have actually softened since then. Right.
Right.
Because so if you and this will get us back to ontological. If you say, hey, Pat Flynn had a near-death experience, right? I don't say impossible. That's a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm gonna say, well, maybe he did, but I'm gonna try to explain the evidence in a different way, or I'm gonna say, okay, show me the EKG, right? Show me the fMRI, all that. I'm gonna look for an empirical way of tipping the scale one way or another on something like that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's implicitly I'm saying it's possible. Right. There's an implicit possibility claim there. Mm-hmm. Do you see that?
Oh yeah.
And so something like Pat Flynn said he talked to God today, right? I'll say, I've always thought maybe Pat was schizophrenic. Okay, so let's get the fMRI out and see what's going on in his brain. But note, implicitly there's a possibility claim there, because I'm not saying impossible logical contradiction. I'm saying probably crazy. Mm-hmm. But probably crazy is different from saying impossible. Probably crazy, I think, implies a possibility, or at least open a possibility there, right? Mm-hmm. Like I don't know that it didn't happen,
right?
A priori, right? I know maybe it probably didn't happen a posteriori, and I would look for contravening evidence to it, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't know it didn't happen a priori, right? And that's probably all you need. Now I don't. Okay, so. Modal epistemology is interesting, right? So you could say, are we trying to show that I have to show that it's metaphysically possible that God exists, or it's epistemically possible that God exists, where I know that in fact it's possible that God exists, or for all I know, right, I can't rule out that God exists, right?
Right.
If you get the former, I think, probably the ontological argument works, though that's going to be hard to do, okay? But if you get the latter, I think this is probably what Plantinga is up to, right? With the ontological argument. If you get the latter, the epistemic possibility, for all I know, God exists. Well, then I think you'd say, for all I know, the ontological argument's a pretty good argument, okay? Mm-hmm. And what more does the already, in some sense, committed Christian theist need, right?
Right. Yeah.
It would seem like it's showing that there is some kind of rational grounding to this, because for all I know, this premise is true, and all this other stuff follows from it. So, if you're already committed, I think it would work, right?
Yeah.
Now, and if you get into like what Saint Anselm was actually doing with this argument, that's probably what he's doing. Like he does not appear in a text where he's clearly doing some kind of It's not Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles, right, where he's clearly doing a rational apologetic here. Anselm's just trying to explain what God means to him, right? He's written this for like the consumption of monks, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how much the historical context gets overlooked in many of these debates, right?
Yeah.
So that's good. That's really cool. So I guess that all that is to say that we're probably both much more sympathetic to the ontological argument than many Thomists are. Many Thomists are just super hard line. Thomas rejected it. I'm out, right?
Yeah. That ship sailed for me, right?
Yeah, right. Awesome. So, all right, let's do one, guys. I see your questions coming in over here. Keep them coming. I'll return to that after one more from the document here. Let's see.
From the queue, as it were.
From the queue. This one is a classic one, so we might as well do it. If God knows what we're going to do in the future, then how are we free? The old omniscience free will thing. Jim, you first or me first on this one?
I mean, just kind of the low hanging fruit on this is, if I currently know the mug is on my table, okay, it follows the claim that Jim on certain definitions of knowledge, Jim knows the mug is on the table. It follows, right, necessarily the mug is on the table. Okay, so the knowledge claim entails the truth of this of the embedded statement.
Yeah, because you're just reaffirming that really, like, if I'm running, then I'm running. Well, I'm running.
Exactly.
Well, therefore I'm running. Like, that's just restating the principle of identity.
So
really,
the fact that it's known entails that it is, but that doesn't tell us the causal story about how it came about. It's just like Boethius, right?
Right.
And so I don't see why that would change on future things either. Okay, so that I knew all along the mug would be on the table doesn't mean my knowledge is causing it, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, of course, I think there's deeper problems with our freedom in relation to God than the omniscience, right? I mean, the fact it's that, we think God is omniscient. He knows everything that happened, and is going to happen, because in a sense he's doing it. Okay, that's the real problem here,
right? That's the thing I always point out. Like, it's not the omniscience of the issue; it's actually divine universal causality. That's the better question, right? Like, you guys aren't thinking
omniscience is
deeply
a symptom. It's not the actual like virus, right?
Right. So
if you read Thomas and you ask Thomas, why is God omniscient? He says, because he's doing it. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. God knows through himself. God knows things other than himself through himself and as their cause.
Their cause.
That's the key. And now I don't think there is an incompatibility. Of course, I've been Matthew's grant owes me a commission check at some point for how much I've been pushing his book, because his whole book, Free Will and God's Universal Causality, is specifically on this, and his whole project is showing we can actually maintain a robust account of libertarian freedom and robust providence and God's universal causality. So I'll point in the direction of that. Of course, I had a conversation with him not recently, so people can just go check that out for some of the details. But a few things that I think just generally confuse people with this question. So first off, there is often, like we were talking about, modal logic. There is a modal fallacy that happens in instances. So even if you think God has future knowledge, which classical theists will push back on, or foreknowledge, we'll say, no, God has eternal knowledge, right? So God knows things through himself and as their cause. All moments in time are present to God, right? So it's like me knowing Jim right now, because it's present, right? It's not future. But even if it were future, like if I were to look into a crystal ball and see that Jim is freely eating a hamburger, how does that at all show, and assuming the crystal ball is reliable, that Jim isn't freely eating the hamburger, right? Like, necessarily I know that Jim will eat the hamburger doesn't mean that necessarily Jim had to eat the hamburger. You see? There's a shift there that's illegitimate. So even if necessarily God knows you will freely do X, that means that X will in fact happen, no doubt. But it doesn't mean that X had to happen, that necessarily you had to do X, right?
Yep. It doesn't tell us
there's some modal sloppiness that goes on in some of these arguments. But then we can also just say, no, well, God's eternal, right? So like we don't even have the foreknowledge issue anyways. God knows things as being their cause, and all for people who want what I think is the best account of eternity and time, I would point to Eleanor Stump's book Aquinas and her ET reference frames account. I think that's really well done. And then as Jim brought up, the deeper question is, well, how does God, because anything that exists apart from God exists only because God causes it to be. And there's no fly zone to God's universal causality, including our actions, right? So the deeper question is, how
in
does
one of the 10 categories, it's a being, right?
Right. It's a being. So then the question isn't with omniscience, right? That's the wrong way to think about it. It's with causality.
Yep.
And that's where we gotta recognize God's causality is so utterly transcendent, right? That God can move contingent things contingently. He can cause us to freely decide on certain actions. There's great mystery there, but what Grant's work is beautiful, because what Grant does is shows with divine universal causality and divine simplicity, we have an ontology which clears away all the worries of determinism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Grant isn't showing like this is how it works specifically in all the details. I don't think we can know that aside from asking God directly. But Grant shows this is why the inference to determinism is unjustified, right? So if we have other reasons to think that just because something is caused, it can't be free, and that we are legitimately free, then there's no conflict here. There's no incompatibility, right? Mm-hmm. And that might be the best we can do. But for me, that's good enough. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with any of that or disagree with any of that, Jim?
Yeah, definitely. I'll say this though. Yeah, I agree 100%, and I think that in Matthews is in this line from Davies. He studied with Davies, right? And so there's kind of a Davies school that Matthews, I think, is the next step in, right? He's gone beyond it, right? And I think that line is the only plausible line, right? Mm-hmm. But don't get your hopes up though that you're going to get a mechanism of how this works, right? Yeah, that is available to us,
right? And when it comes to God's causality, we shouldn't be surprised. It's going to be sui generis by default, right?
There can be no analogy to it, right? And you always get people, well, it's like you're pushing a truck with a little kid, and the adult is doing most of the work and the kid's doing a little bit of the work. No, God is sufficient for his effects, right? It's a different order. There can be no analogy to because there's no analogy to creation in creation, right? So I think attempts to give analogies or examples that explain it are just make the problem worse.
So there's one analogy I think I always hesitate to give it.
I have one too. Yeah,
the author to the book, right?
Yeah, and that's what's her name? I'm forgetting her name now. Who came up with it?
I forget, but many people have used it.
Kathleen Rogers.
Was it?
Yeah.
Just real quick, the idea is like, God's relation to the world is something like an author who can think an entire book all at once. The whole book, everything that happens in the book is present before God, right? Mm-hmm. Even if the characters in the book move along in a specific sequence. God is the cause of everything in the book, including the free actions that anybody does in the book, right? Yeah. And there's the analogy will obviously limp for the obvious reasons, but I think that's probably the best we're going to do if we're going to use an analogy at all, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's Kathleen Rogers, and she has a book on like a text, really really good textbook on like divine simplicity, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, she uses The Wizard of Oz, right? I like to use Harry Potter, right?
Yeah.
And what I would, so in Rawlings' story, right, Harry really does tell all the lies he tells. He really does it, and he could have done otherwise in the story, right? And he deserves the bad consequences of his telling those lies in the story. Okay, so Harry has libertarian freedom in the story. Okay, but whose story is it? It's Rawlings' story. Okay. Right. And the difference is that, Rawlings' stories aren't real in the sense that God's story is real. And that's where the rub. Okay, like she's, okay, what does it mean to make something real like that? But now we're just asking, like, what does it mean to create? And I think you've now just bounced off the edge of the box we're trapped in, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But if you can realize that if you were to translate those stories as real, that's probably the best we'll do analogically, right?
Yes.
So cool. Yeah, good. We're in agreement there. All right. Everyone's favorite topic, hell. Jim's view of hell. This was echoed by Daniel as well. Is he a hopeful universalist or what?
Yeah. I just don't think it's any of my business. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know. I think, God, God has every right to do whatever God does. Okay. But I find like these kinds of questions, I don't know why it's my business about whether anybody will go to hell but me, right? Mm-hmm. And possibly my children, right? For whom I have responsibility, but ultimately it will be theirs, right? Mm-hmm. So I think on the whole hell question, and I'll admit I don't even think about hell very often. I just think about like, what the hell I've done and why I'm not going to do it again. Right.
Right.
It's about enough for me on this. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm strongly with you. I picked up the label hopeful universalist because I wrote an article of being actually a hopeful universalist,
Yeah.
right?
Father Newhouse line. Yeah.
Which is even more qualified, right? So I think there's a couple things that I think about with this, right? Is that first, start with what's clear. What's clear is that it seems like the possibility of hell is indeed a datum that we have to deal with, right?
Mm-hmm.
What else is clear is that God is perfectly loving, just, and merciful. All right.
Mm-hmm.
How all that works out, we can't allow it to interfere with the things that are clear. And there's a lot of wild speculation and caricatures. Like, I'm actually okay just with that. Like, whatever the thing is, I can trust that it's going to be just, it's going to be merciful, it's going to be loving. And that humans, I think it is important that humans do have significant moral autonomy. And there's a line that's been underdeveloped that if Jim, you're talking about, like, if I ever do my PhD, maybe I would pursue this. Because given God's universal causality, we do want to say that God could move everybody in a certain way, but he doesn't. So the question is, well, why doesn't he? And I think a lot of it comes down, Maritain pushes this line, but like I said, I think it's been underdeveloped in the tradition that a wise God, perfectly wise God, moves things according to their nature. And anything God creates that isn't God, and of course there can only be one God, is going to be naturally fallible, right?
Right.
There can only be one impeccable being, and that's God. Right. So God is going to work with us in the general run. Can there be miracles? Can there be exceptions? Of course. But in the general run, there's going to be a governance where God will allow us to fail. Now, he's going to give us everything we need to succeed. Don't get me wrong. But there's a wisdom there of God moving things according to their nature. And if he didn't, then what's the point of having natures to begin with, right? So this is kind of what I call a soft free will defense, if that makes sense. Like so the question isn't like, because sometimes the hard free will defenses say that God couldn't move everybody or couldn't save everybody. That'd be like a Molinist line or something like that. I think that's false, given what we said about universal causality. The question is, why wouldn't God do it? Right. That's the question. And I think it has something, I'm quite convinced of this. It has something to do with the types of things God has created and how a wise God works with those things, respects their being. Right. So that's the direction that I would start to move with a question like this. And that's a good thing. God lets us be who we are in the general run. And in the same sense that, yes, God can do miracles here and there. It wouldn't make sense if God did miracles all the time. That would make nonsense of nature. It would make nonsense of creation. Same thing. God could move a St. Paul, right, in an infallible way. But in the general run, he's going to move things according to the type of thing that they are. And we're inherently fallible. Right. So we can and obviously do fail. Can God work with that? Yes, he obviously does. In ways that are sometimes clear, sometimes not clear. So those are like some seeds of a Pat Flynn way of thinking about it.
Like it.
But yeah, I guess I am a hopeful. Notice the double hopefuls there, right?
Yeah. Right.
The double hopefuls. Right?
I hope I can be hopeful.
Yeah.
Second order.
But at the same time, I think you have to perform and I think I'm definitely not a universalist in the sense of the strong form that has seemed to have been condemned, right? Of that either claiming that God has to move everyone to salvation, or that we know God will. So either like this sort of metaphysical certitude or epistemic certitude. I definitely hedge against that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. Good questions, guys. Like I said, Jim, there weren't really like any low ones here. If we had to summarize our worldview with 5 books, what would they be? That's a good one. Let me think. I'm going to do 2 from Norris Clark, 1 in the Many, and Explorations in Metaphysics. He's going to give you some epistemology too. Bernard Lonergan's Insight. In fact, I have it right here. This is my reading for today on Good Friday. Eleanor Stump's Atonement. Have you read this one, Jim?
No, I haven't.
Phenomenal. Can't recommend it enough. This is good. So who did I say for Clark, Lonergan? I'm not going to say Aquinas because I'm already bringing in contemporary Thomists. Stump's Atonement. just Maritain. I'm just going to say Maritain on the whole issue of evil and sin and all that. In fact, here's another good one that I have here. This is a really good newer one.
I've seen that. Yep.
Building off the sort of Maritain. I think it is really important to contemplate deeply the nature of sin and evil. I think you can't be I think you can't be lazy about that, as many people are.
Know thyself, man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that was that 4 or 5? Jim, you start filling in some of your answers here. Why I think I don't want to be hasty. Is there 5 books that summarize Jim Madden's worldview?
Yeah, right. Sophocles, Oedipus trilogy. Okay, we'll call that one book, maybe.
That's
okay.
Fine. You can do lumps.
So Oedipus Rex, Antigone, Oedipus Clonus. Okay. The Nicomachean Ethics, right?
I'm stealing that one. I was thinking like Austin Fagothi's like Right and Reason and a Contemporary Read, but it all goes back to
I know. Yeah, like saying Nicomachean Ethics is like your favorite book. It's like saying Van Halen's your favorite metal band. Like, okay, fine,
okay,
right, okay, fine.
Just not that interesting, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah, fine. Anyone.
You haven't told me anything new. That's the thing, right? I'm trying to give people like some things maybe they haven't read or know they've read. Right?
Yeah. So, but definitely I'll go. I will go. The 3 Tragedies by Sophocles, right? Mm-hmm. They pose the problem to me. Okay. And I'll go, I'm going to go, man, so maybe scales. I'm going to go Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Okay. Not for where it comes out, but for its way of thinking about thinking, of seeing so much this as a moving target and dealing with the tragic problem as a kind of moving target. Okay. Mm-hmm. I will go McIntyre's which one though, right?
After Virtue, Rational Dominion.
Yeah, it's tough. I'm gonna probably go I'm gonna go Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, the most recent one. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because I think it's his Summa, right? So what am I up to? I'm up to 3-ish there, right?
Let's
yeah.
5.
5, yeah. I would go. There's a book written by Dreyfus and Doherty called All Things Shining. Okay, which is not my view of things, but it's another answer to the tragic problem. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it is something I need to contend with. It's so, and then I'll finally put on that Charles Taylor's, and I will go with Taylor. Which book by him? I will go. I'll go A Secular Age, right? Okay, because that too is it's in conversation with Doherty and Dreyfus, right?
Yeah, that's solid.
Yeah. So what Doherty and Dreyfus are doing, like, so I think what you have in McIntyre is the attempt to answer the tragic problem from a Christian Aristotelian perspective, right? Mm-hmm. I think you have in Taylor an attempt to answer the tragic problem, right, in a Christian non-Aristotelian sort of Hegelian Heideggerian perspective. And you have in Dreyfus and Doherty an attempt to answer the tragic problem in a I don't even say in a sort of polyistic pagan way, right? Not literally so though, right? Yeah.
That's great. I'll so I'm still 1 book off. I'll just second Grant's book again, because like you said, Grant's is kind of like where the conversation is at in a very long line of thought.
Yeah,
in terms of the nature of God, God's universal causality, providence, grace, sin, all those big questions. I think Grant does just such a good job of
if you understand Grant, you understand Davies, right? You understand Davies, you understand, these like
right. He's bringing insights from like Lonergan and all these other great thinkers as well. So you couldn't go like, if you want, the idea of this question I get is like, if you want to get a general picture of how Pat or Jim thinks, these books will give you it. So definitely Grant there.
And I include the Sophocles stuff because I really, the older I get, the more I realize is like I have been dealing with Sophocles since I got into this, right? And because the first philosophy book I read cover to cover was Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's funny, man, because I got Mencken. Do you know Mencken?
Mm-hmm. I know of
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
So he was a guy that started like me off on my path towards like the atheist existentialist. He's still one of my favorite people to read. I mean, he's just like an old school Christopher Hitchens, exceedingly polemic, very witty. And like it's interesting to see a guy who is a journalist. Like I was rereading some of his essays not long ago, and he's like going after Molinism. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
All right, he's not completely superficial either. But he wrote one of the first books in English on Friedrich Nietzsche. So he's the one that like passed me off to those guys. And looking back, that book wasn't actually great, but I think it's still worth reading. I mean, just go to the thinkers directly now at this point. All right, Ethan wants to know, what do we think of Aquinas' proof for the immateriality of the intellect?
Which one?
Yeah, I was gonna say which one? Which one? Yeah. Like if we're talking like James Ross style, which obviously is a development off of generally Thomistic lines of thought, I'm a huge fan of that. Why did I get blurry all of a sudden?
Yeah, no, I know. I'm glad it's not me.
Yeah, there we go.
Am I having an episode? Right? What's going on? Pat's fading. Right. I mean, there's so many of these, right? And I think usually what people mean by this is, okay, so Thomas has all sorts of way like arguments for immortality, intellect, and you also understand too. And Thomas, something I've conflated too. He does not see immortality of intellect as the same argument as immortality of the soul. Okay. Because he said, something could be immaterial in that it's separable, but it's not necessarily immortal, right?
Right.
As an individual. And I think in some ways he's understanding like Aristotle's arguments for the immortality of the intellect are not arguments for immortality, because it's very clear Aristotle does not think an individuated soul is immortal, right? Okay. And so something I think, and I'm not quite sure which of those two, say, Ross is trying to do in his proof, right? I think what Ross is doing, though, is sort of inspired by what Thomas does in his, was it the commentary on Corinthians, right? Is where you actually get the argument for abstraction, right? And you don't find it in the Summas, right? In the Summas, it's always Aristotle's argument for de anima plus an argument about the simplicity of the soul, therefore it's immortal, right? Now, what do I think about these arguments, without going into all the details? There's so many details. Is I think they are all plausible, right? I don't think any of them at this point I can say ascend to absolute proof where someone would be irrational for not accepting them, right?
Especially because they ride on so many prior metaphysical
assumptions,
right? That's the key. Like don't just start at like premise conclusion. Like you got to do the metaphysics to really feel the force of some of these, right?
And I think negotiable things in psychology and negotiable things in cognitive science and things like that. And this is where I think we have to be realistic. A lot of these things, are we asking, are they proofs, or are they show that you're not crazy? Okay. And I think they show you're not crazy. If you say the intellect's immaterial, did they send a proof? No, I think there's too many things that are controversial for us in a way that they weren't then. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The way I see Ross is it's building off of Aquinas' idea that we can entertain universals. Any material thing is a particular that would include brain states. There's something over and above brain states, right? Ross gets more specific with determinacy.
Yep.
Now, if you were to ask me, I think Ross's argument is decisive for what it intends to demonstrate. I do. Now, what you want to bring out of that is another good question. One thing that's interesting is like, because sometimes people, this is just kind of an aside. I was talking with somebody this yesterday. Is I often see people, even philosophers, like confuse humility with always saying they're not sure about things.
Yeah.
And that's wrong to me, right? Like humility is just kind of like knowing where you're at in many different ways. Not acting like you're less sure about something if you are. Now you might be wrong, but if you ask me like what I think about something, I'll give you my honest answer. And I think Ross's argument is decisive.
There's nothing wrong with saying that, and right. Thinking that and arguing it, right?
But you see what I'm saying in general, right? This kind of like confusion of what humility is. There's many things where I'll say I'm not sure. I don't know, right? And it put more things than not. But there's a few things I'm like, no, I think this settles the matter, right?
With all these arguments, something in recent years that really has struck me, and it's really affected my later work on this, is Elizabeth Anscombe in this posthumously published paper. I mean, she had given it as a presentation, but she had read it aloud, right, in public, but it wasn't published until I think after her death. Called Immortality of the Soul, right? She makes this point. So like Anscombe didn't buy these arguments, right? Okay. And she makes this point that just because you prove something has no material organ doesn't prove it has an immaterial organ. It might just not be the kind of thing that can be identified with the activity of any particular organ at all, right? Mm-hmm. I think all of these arguments show the latter. They show that whatever cognition is, it's not the sort of thing that can be identified with the operation of any particular material organ at all. Okay. Where I worry that a leap is being made is
but that is significant, right?
For certain, and that's that's all I think I need, right?
Okay. Because we're eliminating one thing from the table of options here that has a lot of that has huge grip on people, right?
Yeah, and I know you have this premise on all these immaterial arguments that's in premise I've pulled out myself, right? That where act there follows being, right? So you've had this immaterial act, then there must be an immaterial being that does it, etc. I'm less confident in that than I was, and moreover, it assumes once again that everything that happens is the doing of some discrete organ, right?
Right.
And that's an assumption I don't make anymore.
Yeah. So I definitely am committed to action following being, but I don't think that entails the organ conclusion like you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And now what the immaterial arguments would show is it indeed in our cognition, in our making explicit the normative structure of thought in the particularly human way, as far as we know, we're in contact with something that is indeed not material. We're in contact with it. We're somehow in relation to it. We're ordered to it. Okay. That is not metaphysically insignificant, right? Okay.
Yeah. And Therese Corey has some really good stuff on this. Yes. So I would point in how to think about what exactly is immateriality, right? And certainly in her view, and I agree with this, it just comes down to some degree of less restrictedness, right? We'll maybe do I reached out to her, so we'll see if we can get her on.
I would love to talk to her.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Callum has a cool question here. Views on self-defense. Is sparring ethical? Competing in combat sports? ? Jim, you better hope. You better hope it's ethical.
Yeah. I mean, views on self-defense, I don't have many of them. I don't do jiu-jitsu for self-defense reasons, right? I like Jocko's claim on this. In one of his books, he says, people ask him, what's the best self-defense? What's the best self-defense? And he says, if you really need to defend yourself from other human beings, you need a gun. Okay. Right. And meaning, and know how to use it, et cetera, right? So if you really are in situations where you may be killed by other human beings, or I guess bears, right? Okay. What have you is you need responsible firearm ownership, whatever our views about that are. Okay. We're not waiting. Okay. And so I don't do jiu-jitsu for self-defense. Now, do I think it could very well come in handy? Hell yeah. Right. Okay.
I'd rather know it than not. Right.
I'd rather know it than not. Yeah. But I didn't feel a need at 43 years old to I don't know, man, I might get another bar fight someday. I better go learn jiu-jitsu. Right. Okay. So that wasn't it. Is sparring ethical, competing in combat sports? I think it's perfectly ethical, right? Especially in jiu-jitsu, where it's no more dangerous. I mean, if you're going to say jiu-jitsu were unethical, then football's gone. Right. Okay. Collegiate wrestling's gone. Right. I think all sorts of things are gone. Okay. Contact sports are gone. And I think, there is an interesting thing in combat sports like boxing and MMA where you can actually be graded on the damage you're doing to another human being. Okay. That's I can get why someone might worry, like you have to kind of intend harm by doing this, right? But I also think there is the fact of the matter that the other person can stop this at any time he or she wants, right? And I know I'm not saying volition is the only mark of the ethical, right? But in something like an MMA fight, your opponent can stop it at any point, right? And even in MMA, it is not combat. It is limited by rules. We have drawn a line. Like, you cannot fish hook the other dude, right? Okay, you can't. There's no eye gouging. There's no kicking to the groin. So it's still, it's limited, right? It's limited. And I think where there's a limit on it, you are not allowed to do things that are purely destructive in causing mortal damage to another human being, right?
Yeah.
So if you actually went in there doing things that can only be intended to kill someone, that's not allowed. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Are you doing things that are going to hurt that person and could result in terrible damage, even mortal damage? Yes. Okay. But these things can be done where death is accidental, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've eliminated things where death wouldn't be accidental. Now in jiu-jitsu, in MMA too, there are moves, right, where death is not accidental to the rear naked choke, right? That is okay. But there, it is always called off at that point. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So for me, I agree. There's going to be a threshold where we're going to say, no, that isn't ethical. And I would just need to think about each particular sport, right? And where the lines are drawn. But certainly I want to say rolling, totally cool, right?
Yeah, totally cool.
Taekwondo, what I did, totally. I like, really, it's Taekwondo. At this point, to me, is just kind of like a sophisticated game of adult tag, right? Kind of like more tapping, right? You don't really see like hardcore knockouts in Taekwondo very often, right? It's kind of just point scoring and stuff like that. Right?
It's not cool when it happens, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then it would be like, okay, well, even if we thought about the head contact or something like that, and rule, then then you would just modify it, right? But yeah, for me, it would just be, it's not something you can answer generally. It would have to come down to the particular sport and the lines that are drawn, right?
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I mean, so look, gladiatorial games in ancient Rome, those are out. Okay. Right. Okay. The Running Man, no go. Right. Okay. Jiu-jitsu, yeah, we're good.
Yeah. How you doing, Jim? Battery and time.
Yeah, you're good? Battery is, we're good on battery. Yeah, and time's good too.
Thanks for the questions, guys. These are really good. Tim has a good question here. I'd love to hear Dr. Madden talk about social media in light of his talk on technology hosted at Thomistic Institute, where he cites a certain Japanese philosopher. I have no idea what that talk was, Jim, but it sounds interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So, in the, and this is a major theme in my nearly completed book right now, is actually technology is like the theme of the book, really. Okay. What I try to in what Tim is referring to is a lecture I gave on philosophy of technology, and the main figure in the lecture is a Japanese philosopher named Nishitani, who gave a kind of natural philosophy and in light of modern technology. Okay, and the point in that critique of technology and Heidegger's critique of technology, which is immensely important in my thinking, is that the problem with technology is not the devices. Okay, it's no particular device is in fact the problem. Okay, the way Heidegger puts it is, we didn't make, he's talking about industrial technology in this essay, we didn't make making the factory didn't make us technological. We made the factory because we were technological, right? Like the cell phone didn't make us technological. We made the cell phone because we were already technological. We were attracted to it because we were technological. Okay. So for me, the issue in technology is not whether any particular device, etc., is or is not good for us. I mean, I think there's perfectly good questions about all that. The question is, what attitude towards being has led us down a path where we've predicated our lives on all these technologies. Okay.
Yeah.
As far as something like social, and I've, as Pat knows, I've had a fairly tortured relationship with social media to like,
we all do.
Yeah. And for a lot of years, until here we are now, almost complete abstinence from it.
Okay, yeah, so I drug you into the pit.
Yeah, you've drugged me. Yeah, no, jiu-jitsu drugged me in because I hadn't had an active Facebook account in probably 8 years, and then the only way my communicates is through Facebook. Okay, so it's like I had to rekindle the dormant fire there, right? And so for me, and when I'm doing that lecture, it's the question isn't, is this particular device or media good or bad? Okay, the question is, what does our attitude about the world, what is our obsession with it show us as our attitude towards the world or towards being. Okay. And so then therein opens these phenomenological questions. Okay. Nishtani sees technology, machine technology, is like it's like the perfection of nature and its downfall all at once, right? Because in as much as we're technological, we understand the laws of nature, and so we make the laws of nature explicit in abstract perfection in building technology, right? And that liberates us from nature, right? Okay, in a lot of ways, like as I put in that paper, you know, the leisure that allows us to do philosophy is bought and paid for by the machine, right? Okay, so the machine, you know, brings nature fulfillment and bring the laws of nature as into explicit abstraction. Okay, and it liberates us from nature. But yet, as soon as it comes to the point where it gives us the impression that all our desires should be met by the machine, where desire is now like the anomalous state, not the normal state, then we lose any need to develop practical rationality anymore. And we're going to like subhumanize ourselves. Right. Yeah. Okay. And so I think you could look at any technology and see that same cycle where it liberates us from nature. It's a kind of an interesting abstract fulfillment of nature. And then inevitably
re-enslaves us.
And and then it just returns us to a subhuman status. Right. Okay. It reinserts us back into nature. Okay. And so can social media, you know, does it have to be, you know, so right now, what are Pat and I doing? We are using social media, right? We're on YouTube, right? And technology, right? And we're providing an occasion for true capital L leisure of the sort that Aristotle saw as the achievement of civilization. Okay.
Right.
And this
because I said, I'm not doing any work today. This isn't work.
Yeah. This is not work.
This is like what I would like wake up, have coffee with Jim. This is this is just fun for me. Right.
And by the way, I now count Pat Flynn among my good friends, and I have never met him in person.
Cheers.
Cheers. You know what I mean? I mean, so like I am no longer in a position to say social media bad because I have at least one good friend, right? That I know only through social media.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that not just about you, but Gavin and a number of other people.
Yeah. I mean, when's the last time you had a friend in person, Pat?
15 years.
15 years, yeah. But anyway, sorry. So what is this technology doing? It is liberating us from nature in a way. It's like we're transcending the limitations of time and space. For Pat Flynn and I had this conversation, and with Tim Troutman and all these other people, boom, that's great. We're liberated from nature. And yet the fact that now I feel like I can have nature on demand, I can have Pat on demand, right? Just means now I'm kind of less skilled in dealing with him as a human being, right? Okay. And I'm more tempted to see you as an object of easy desire fulfillment than I am as something I have to work with in a push-pull relationship with reality, right? Which is going to lead, it's going to atrophy or could atrophy my virtues and my ability to control impulse, and it's going to dehumanize me, or it could.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's good. That's deep. Where is this talk? Do we have a replay of this anywhere?
There is a version of it on the SoundCloud for TI.
Yeah. Again, listeners, if you have Google up, maybe you could just like Google Jim Madden Thomistic Institute and throw it in the comments. Some of his talks, that would be super helpful.
And just the way of things to come. This problem is the culminating theme of the new book. Yeah. It's seeing this problem in the light of philosophy mind.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
I can't wait. Follow up from one of the previous ones. Very good question about the combat sport thing. I've always wondered if watching UFC or boxing is ethical, since you're probably rooting for someone to beat up or knock out someone else. Let me just say a quick thing about this, and that is, of course, in ethics, intentions matter. So it's like, if the only reason you're going to a NASCAR race is because you hope somebody crashes, burns, and dies, I don't know if that's an issue with NASCAR per se, so much as it is about your prior dispositions, right? See what I'm saying? Right.
Yeah.
And just, mutatis mutandis with UFC, right?
Yep. I was not interested in MMA until I took up jiu-jitsu. Right. And maybe for reasons that the listener brings up. And because I didn't understand it. Right. Okay. And it's interesting that, the more I've gone into the combat sports realm, the more I find football distasteful. Okay. Because now, having done both, I've not done MMA. I've gone to a few MMA practices and realized I am too old and slow, right, for that business. But because now when I see an MMA fight, I am seeing technical detail. right? I am seeing art.
You're
Right?
looking for technicians and art, right?
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
that you hope somebody gets black eyes or their
yeah,
head
yeah,
in, right?
exactly. Like, a lot of times the 30-second knockout is like the least interesting fight to me. Okay. It's like when they get in the ground and do some damn good jiu-jitsu, or you see some really good kickboxing, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Or like a really good pass in NASCAR, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But look, here's the deal is and this is the human condition. If it weren't for the risk of, getting your face caved in with an elbow, right? The art would be less interesting. Right.
It just wouldn't be the same art.
It's because it's raised the stakes. We need mortal stakes to make the art really interesting and to push it to that point. Right. Did you see that? And if it weren't for the risk of the crash, right? NASCAR, these guys would not be as good, right?
Yeah, or Formula One, right?
Yeah, and we wouldn't.
What makes it so good is how fast it freaking is, right?
Yeah, and like invisible gases blowing up and stuff. Yeah,
super dangerous, right?
Super dangerous. Yeah,
and I would say there is something wrong if you're just watching Formula One because you hope to see some burning corpse. Like that's sick, right? That isn't what we want.
Yeah, and every time I've dealt with myself or a teammate, or even one of my kids who got hurt in a combat sport, I've always said, if that weren't a possibility, this would not be as noble as it is. Right. If you couldn't get hurt doing this, it wouldn't be as noble as it is. Right. So I think that in human beings, why do we run the planet? Because we are like the most violent species to ever walk the earth. We fight really, really well. Like team fighting seems to be much of what the brain came on to do. And so like to act like we don't need to address that at some level culturally, individually, I think is naive. Okay. So we need it. And two, I think that violence in sport, right, is part of what makes it noble. And it's part of what forces the development of it as an art. Yeah. Yeah. But if you're sitting there like, oh man, I hope I see this guy's face get caved in, I think, that's a bad occasion. Right. And moreover, I think you don't understand what's going on. And I think you're really missing.
You're just ignorant of the art itself. Right?
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
And you should go get punched sometime and see if you really think you can root for somebody to get their face caved in. Yeah.
Right. Eric says, what does it mean that God's relation to the world is unreal? Doesn't it follow that we are incapable, sorry for EO terminology, of participation in God's energies, which is necessary for theosis? Yeah. So a few remarks on this. One is, so I guess this is getting to the idea of mixed relations with God and creation, that creatures have a real relation to God. God only has a rational relation to creatures. It's very important not to get mixed up on the terminology here. This is talking about sort of what's on the ontological scene. It's not at all saying that we can't have a real relationship with God. That's not what the Thomistic view of mixed relations talks about. Of course we can have a real relation with God. We're being created by God, right? Yeah. The idea of mixed relations simply means that there's no real ontological foundation in God for the creature, and that really dependency is unidirectional. That's what it means. All creatures are dependent on God. God is in no way dependent upon creatures. As for theosis, I think there's a quick answer to this. We have an obediential potency, which is actualized by God, which allows for that. So that will always be created on the creature side, even though it comes from the uncreated God. So there's just, when I talk with some Eastern Orthodox people who criticize Thomism on this account, there's just semantic and terminological issues. And we have to understand that we're talking about different things. For Thomists, we're talking about the ontology, directionality, divine universal causality, divine simplicity, that the action of the agent is in the patient, to bring in some Thomistic Aristotelian lines. In fact, somebody else asked a question on the document, if God is pure act, then how does he do anything? Well, the answer is because what he does, the action is in the patient. So God doesn't need to change to bring something about, right? The potency, this would be called God's active potency. God has no passive potency, but of course he has active potency that he can bring about things extrinsic to himself, which the idea of mixed relationships is talking about, right? So I think that that these issues are mostly just terminological, and once you get clear on what's being talked about and what the metaphysics is, there's actually no issue here, right? And that the actualization of our obediential potency to experience and participate in the life of God, there's no more issue there than the fact that we participate in existence, right? Which we're doing right here and now, that God grants to us, because only God has existence per se. Everything else has existence via participation. I don't know if do you want to add anything to that, Jim?
That would all go over my theological pay grade, right? So, I agree with everything you said. I don't know enough about the Eastern Orthodox thing to really comment. Yeah.
Yeah. So they, I mean, it depends who you talk to, right? So I don't
Yeah.
want to say Eastern Orthodox is wrong because there's many different schools of
Yeah.
thought,
As there's
and
many Western views. Yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
it's like, all right, if you want to say that there's a real distinction between God and God's energies, then I am going to have a metaphysical issue, right?
Right.
If you want to say it's a formal distinction, then I'm going to say, okay, well, let's cash it out because there might be an issue or there might not be an issue, right? So
Right.
it's just going to depend on what the account is, and of course, there's many different accounts from Eastern Orthodox on
Sure.
this,
Sure.
right? Cool. All right, Jim. Why don't we do one more? You know what, Jim?
Sure.
Here's a good practical one.
Sure.
Somebody said they failed horribly at Lent, and what advice would we have going into Easter? So maybe like attitude.
Have a fun Easter, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
what's your Lenten attitude these days? Like, what would you advise? Because like we've all been there, right? Where we set
Yeah.
not just spiritually, but even fitness. We set big goals, and
Yeah.
we sometimes slip up, right?
Yeah. I mean, and it's with anything, right? I mean, well, first of all, like, I guess like what's a bad Lent? I mean, like, you didn't take the ice bath every morning, and like you ate dairy products or something. I mean, did you just set the bar too high, right? And if you're going to get into asceticism, like anything, you're going to have to like build this slowly over a number of years, et cetera, right? And I think the idea that somehow like if I had a quote unquote bad Lent is going to affect how I celebrate Easter, I think you're kind of like drifting into almost Pelagian territory here, right? Like somehow you had to earn the Easter by Lent, right? Do you know what I mean? I mean,
by jelly beans specifically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would look at it and say, look, you don't earn your Easter by Lent, right? And what is Lent? It's an occasion. It's an occasion to get better, right? If you feel you failed an occasion, sure, you missed an occasion, right? But once again, God willing, you'll be around next year. You can get up and try again, right? Which might be like the whole point of Lent, right? You know what I mean? So yeah, my advice to the good listener here would be, hey, enjoy that Easter ham, right? Have some fun, right? But don't like starve yourself the next 72 hours to make sure you like made up for a bad Lent or something like that, right?
I completely agree.
You just found out you too are fallible, right? Welcome to us. Yeah.
Welcome to the club, my friends.
Welcome to the club. Yeah.
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 Beautiful. This has been a blast. Thanks for all the great questions, everyone.
You said yes. Was there a Hegel question? I'm just intrigued. Even if we can't do it.
I didn't write it down, unfortunately, but there was one that came in. It was something about something like just what are our general thoughts on Hegel. So why don't you just run with that for a minute?
Yeah. I mean, I've this year I've been like revisiting Hegel quite a bit, right? So, and I think if you're going to understand our situation, you have to understand Hegel very profoundly, very, very profoundly. And because Hegel is the first, I think, self-conscious critic of the Enlightenment. Okay. Robert Brandom says Hegel is the first postmodern thinker. And I think Brandom's correct on this. He was the first one who could sit back, sort of looking back on the revolution, looking back and something saying, geez, what the hell have we done? Right. But yet without saying, we're going to like make Europe great again by returning to the 12th century. Okay. So I do think Hegel is something that needs to be understood, and I think needs to be better understood in like Catholic circles.
And one thing, just because the way that postmodernism has gotten thrown around, not all postmodernism thought is a bad thing, right?
No,
some of it is very good and very needed, right? Sometimes people just associate postmodernism with like this very what they feel is just absurd form of relativism. It's much greater than that.
What they heard from a semi-educated graduate student teaching their introduction to philosophy class, right? Right. This came up in our conversation with Nietzsche, right? I mean, postmodernism originates in a pushback against radical scientism, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So now, can that be taken too far? Yes. Has it? Yes.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yes. Good stuff. So what's your Good Friday look like, Jim? Just curious.
I'm gonna go and do some Turkish get-ups. Right. That's the next move.
Right. A little self-mortification.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, no, if that's mortification, then
I'll take it all day long. Yeah.
If that's wrong, I don't want to be right, baby. Yeah, you know. Gosh, I love that one.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm gonna do my get-ups, get a walk in here, and then lie low this afternoon. Hit the Good Friday service, right?
Yep. Yeah, we're doing mass at noon.
Yeah,
that's a plan.
I'll train tonight. I'll go do some jiu-jitsu tonight, and then start getting ready for the big one on Sunday for Easter.
Beautiful, man. Well, hey, God bless you, Jim, man.
My 16-year-old daughter and her friend, they're doing an egg hunt for all the kids in the neighborhood. They awesome. Have stuffed 250 eggs, right? So I'm looking forward to seeing that play out in the neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sweet. I'm going to be, mass at noon, then going to be working. This is such a beautiful book. If people haven't read this, get Stump's Atonement. It's it's incredible.
Yep.
So I always feel the need to read something like this on.
I'll be working this today.
Yeah. That's we should come back with our thoughts on how to synthesize maybe or something like that.
Yeah, I was thinking something we could do like a regular "What are you reading" segment.
I would, that would be great, man. So I like skim parts of this before, but now I'm doing like the more thorough study of that. So these are my two on the docket for the next couple of days. Sorry, my camera's like backwards.
I finished Mark Sisson's book, so I think we'll be talking about that.
Oh, yeah, on the fitness. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that.
Yeah,
yep,
definitely.
Yeah. What else? And then lying low after mass for a bit, just reading, and then we'll the weather's getting nice here in Wisconsin. So
it's very nice here. It's going to be in the 80s here this weekend. So
yeah. So hey, real quick, listeners, please like, share, comment, subscribe, all that. We really appreciate it. Please check out Jim's wonderful book. Let me put the banner up, Ageless Athlete, which has probably more to do with this conversation than you might suspect.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fitness stuff in there.
There it is.
But there's also a lot of motivational, how to persist, how to think about yourself in ways that are constructive for fitness. So
check that out. And then if somebody hasn't already, I will find those Thomistic Institute talks of yours, Jim, and I will link them in the comments.
Yeah, it's hard for me to link those now because I've rewritten all that since, right? But I'll
it's all good.
In humility, yeah, very good. All right,
it's all good. All right, my brother.
You bet.
God
Thank you, man.
Blessed Good Friday to everyone out there. Yep, we'll talk soon.